This is only my second time doing a sermon up here. When Nika asked us on worship committee, who would like to speak on the Sunday before Labor Day? I didn't raise my hand. But neither did anyone else. But when she said, Rick, maybe you can do something about that transition from working to retirement, I said yes, and my finger started pushing that button. To get ready for this sermon, I am pro-union. I was vice president of UACT, Unified Association of Conejo Teachers. Before I retired, the teachers' union took care of me during my happily brief attempt at getting a special ed credential, and I owed them. Labor Day has been a U.S. holiday since 1894, though New York City had a Labor Day parade in 1882. Way back in 1870, the average work week for most Americans was 61 hours. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, labor unions engaged in massive strikes in order to demand shorter work weeks. Unions, along with organizations like the National Consumers League and the National Child Labor Committee, worked together in the early 20th century to ban child labor. By 1937, labor actions throughout the country created enough political momentum to pass the Fair Labor Standards Act, which helped create a federal framework for shorter work week and child labor standards. Weekends, the 8-hour workday, unemployment benefits, workman's compensation, employer-based health care, family and medical leave, OSHA, all these are just some of the ways that organized labor has changed our civilization. Now, I had in my original sermon some very grim rules from 1870 and 1950 that were about teachers. Like, male teachers may take one evening each week for courting purposes, or 2 evenings a week if they go to church regularly. Or women teachers who married or engaged in improper conduct would be dismissed. But I made the mistake of checking my sources, and Snopes told me that there was no evidence that those lists were real. Now, I retired in 2017, and the transition into retirement has been okay. It has not been what I envisioned. Like so many other parts of our world, COVID changed everything. I'm really thankful that I got out of the profession before COVID. The reports I heard from my teachers that I left behind was that teaching over Zoom and going and that transition after the peak of Zoom had happened, going back into the classroom, all those things were not really something that I would have been good at. I loved being a teacher. Working with children makes sense to me. I know what I'm supposed to do. Camp makes sense to me. I've worked summer and recreation programs since I was 14, and I worked with the Conejo Outdoor Education Program in the second half of each school year from 1979 to 2004. For those of you who don't know about outdoor school, we took 6th graders off to a camp for 5 days and taught them geology, botany, zoology, water cycles, along with other science programs. Took them on hikes. They spent the nights there. It was Camp All Nations in the mountains above Palmdale at the beginning. And then later on, in 1988, we went to Camp Bloomfield, just north of Malibu. And outdoor school continued on that site after I left until just a few years ago, during the Woolsey fire, when the place burned down. And now they're up in Ojai someplace, and those things. I was good at the job. Camp skills were natural to me. I had a loud voice. I learned the basics easily. Both my parents ran camps before they met. They came back from their honeymoon in 1952 when went directly to a Boy Scout camp where my dad was working that summer. I'm built for camp. My first jobs were working at a sports camp my dad ran each summer. Nobody really had to tell me what to do. Problems just show up and you deal with them. Usually I had camp directors and senior staff watching and to make sure that I didn't get in over my head. In 1979, though, I joined the outdoor school program for the Conejo, and I was the assistant director to a man who had never before worked at any camp or been to any camp. So I found myself in the role of boss. And I considered myself a pretty good boss. But I remember a Doonesbury comic strip once where Mike was bragging about his business that he ran. He ran a tech business, and he thought that he was different, that it was a different relationship between him as boss and his employees. And his girlfriend suggested that he go look on the walls of the cubicles. He came back a little bit later, all shaken, and said, "Oh my God, they have Dilbert comics up on their walls." When you're a boss, you lose a little bit of that empathy. I had mostly great bosses over the years, but the boss-employee power relationship is something employees see easily, and bosses so often are blind to the power dynamics. I was probably just as blind as everyone else. An Aesop fable, and excuse me, I always go to the stories. That's one of the things that I do. And there was once a lion, a fox, and a donkey that went hunting together. And they worked together as a team. The fox would find the prey, moving very silently. He'd go back and tell the other two where the prey was. The donkey would go to one side. The lion would go to the other side. The donkey would bray, scaring the prey, usually right into the ambush that the lion set up. And so, at the end of the day, the lion said to the donkey, "Would you divide up our spoils?" And so the donkey made 3 equal piles. That was not okay with the lion, and he promptly dispatched with the donkey and told the fox, "You make the decision about how much we should get." And the fox went and gave everything to the lion and left as quickly as possible. Bosses always seem to make more. The fox could have complained, but who would listen? Another fable. In the forest, there was a flock of quail, and they lived a very happy life until a hunter showed up. And the hunter went and used seeds and calls and gathered the quail together. And then he would take a net and throw it over the top of the quail. They lost many, many quail that way. And then they were talking about it. What should we do? What should we do? And the oldest of the quails said, "The next time the hunter throws the net over us, look to the oldest one of the flock and fly in the direction that they do." And so the next day, when the hunter threw his net, everyone looked at the old quail, and he flew off in the direction toward the thorn bushes, and they all flew with him, and they lifted the net up, and they landed on top of a thorn bush, and they all got away. Now, that happened a couple times during the day, and it wasn't always that the old quail was there, but they always looked for the eldest of the group. And so at the end of the day, the hunter had to go back to his family and explain that he was not able to catch any. They're cooperating. But don't worry. I've seen this before. They always start to argue. So, after a few days of this, there started to be complaints. Some of the quails thought it shouldn't be the oldest quail. It should be the strongest quail. It should be the tallest quail. It should be the hen that had laid the most eggs. It should be them. And they started to argue. And pretty soon, the hunter was able to bring home quail to his family. There I am. Most teachers, parents, and principals have the same goals, but it's easy for things to go wrong. When I compared the expectations that teachers in non-union charter schools had with myself and my teachers in UACT, I could see that there were differences in the number of hours they worked, the working conditions they worked in, salary, and status, frankly. When I realized that I would be retiring, having a community was a priority. I had grown up in churches. My life seems to work better when I have something to do. Sundays, when I have something to do on Sundays. But what most churches believe, I do not. And sooner or later, I was worried that there would be some problems. My original plan was to remain involved in my old school. COVID kind of got in the way. Chalice has been a good spot for me. You are accepting of me, no matter what I believe. You have a wonderful choir, a strong commitment to kids, and an openness to diversity. My life seems to work better here. Creating this sermon, I realized that you are my union. We stand up for each other. We stand up for people in general. UUs seem to buy into the union mantra, an injury toward one is an injury towards all. If I look at the principles that UUs and Chalice hold, and those of my teachers' union, I can see why Chalice is my union. The first principle of UU is about the inherent worth of every person. Unions, for the most part, represent everyone. An old union-busting tactic is to divide us all along racial, economic, and educational and religious lines. Chalice seems to resist division. The second principle is justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. We are a covenantal organization. Unions are close to that. They are a contractual organization. There's a contract. You work to your contract. Third principle, Chalice encourages a spiritual growth in all of their congregations. Unions work to steadily improve safety and financial conditions for their members. Fourth principle, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Unions allow their members to freely and responsibly do their jobs, free from demands outside their contractual obligations. The fifth principle, the right of conscience, the use of the democratic process in our congregations. Unions at their best are strongly democratic, giving the rank and file the chance at leadership positions. Sixth principle, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Unions have always called for workers of the world unite. Seventh principle, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Unions understand that working conditions are a major bargaining condition. The degradation of our environment is the ultimate attack on our working conditions. And that eighth principle that isn't quite official yet, affirms and promotes journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community, by our actions and accountability, dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. Just like we use, my union was actively involved in dismantling racism and other oppressions. And while education itself has not been broken down in terms of race and economics, I think that the union itself, if you look at the leadership, if you look at the people that are involved, has gone and done a great job of that. We are closing with the words of Rose Schneiderman. In the spirit It is the spirit of trade unionism that is most important. The service of fellowship, the feeling that the hurt of one is the concern of all, and that the work of the individual benefits all.